All right, so we are in Numbers chapter 21, and there we are going to quickly, hopefully, cover 3 stories today, right? So, which is a challenge in any of my classes, but we're going to do our best to cover three stories. And basically, what we're going to see is how God not only provides, we've seen a lot of provision, but more works on behalf of his people, okay? So kind of keep that thought in the back of your mind as we go through some of these stories, and you'll hopefully get something out of it then. So we're going to start in a weird starting point this morning in Numbers 21, verses 18 through 20. Numbers chapter 21, verses 18 through 20. The Bible says, "The princes digged the well, the nobles of the people digged it by the direction of the lawgiver with their staves. And from the wilderness they went to Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Nahalel, and from Nahalel to Bamoth, and from Bamoth in the valley that is in the country of Moab to the top of Pisgah, which looketh toward Jeshimon. And Israel sent messengers," and we're going to stop there in 20. Right? So basically, we're picking off, we've talked about the rebellion that the Israelites had. We're fast forwarding like 38 years to this point, and now they are moving towards going into the promised land. Okay, that's the progression that we've just seen there. Okay, they're moving in the direction of the promised land. And now, in verses 21 through 22 is where our story picks up. So Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 and 22. "And Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, Let me pass through thy land. We will not turn into the fields or into the vineyards. We will not drink of the waters of the well, but we will go along by the king's highway until we be past thy borders." Okay. So what we have here is an innocent request by the people of Israel, right? They're moving towards the promised land like God wants them to do. They've been traveling around some of these countries, through some of these countries, to get to where they're supposed to go. So they come up along the land of the Amorites there, and they sent an innocent request. They sent messengers to the king, right? Look, here's what we want to do. We are here. We need to go over there. Can we go by your king's highway there, which is the main thoroughfare of travel? Right? So it's like, look, we're not trying to take over your land. We just need to get from here to there, and yours is the fastest way. We're not going to take any of your food. We're not conquering your land. We're not doing anything. We just need to get from here to there. Please. Right? That's what's going on. Now in verse 23, we see their response. "And Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through his border." Fine. Sihon says no. Okay? "But Sihon gathered all his people together and went out against Israel into the wilderness, and he came to Jahaz and fought against Israel." Right? So here we have the innocent request put forward by Israel. They're not doing anything sneaky. They're not doing anything shifty or shady or whatever. They sent messengers, for crying out loud, saying exactly what they wanted to do. Sihon could have said, "No, I don't want you in my country. Go around me." But he didn't do that. He said no, and guess what? We're at war now. So that escalated quickly, right? But that's what happens. Last week, we learned about how the accusations of the ungodly don't have to make sense, right? You remember that? Okay. This week, we see another step to that. We see how that the responses of the ungodly towards us don't have to make sense either. Okay? Much like in this situation where Israel's coming to the king, right? Sent an embassy there, and is like, look, this is what we want to do. Okay? But they got this hyper response back from Sihon, not just the no, but look, we're going to war now, and they're going to try and kill you. Right? So when, we're witnessing to people, right, the aggressive response that we sometimes get, where does that come from, right? Why does that happen? Does it have to make sense? Look, all I was trying to do was hand them a track, right? And they went off on me. What is up with that? Right? The response of the ungodly does not have to make sense, just like their accusations don't have to make sense. Okay? So, verses 24 through 25. Israel smote him with the edge of the sword and possessed his land from Arnon to Jabbok, even unto the children of Ammon, for the border of the children of Ammon was strong. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel dwelt in all the cities of the Amorites in Heshbon, and in all the villages thereof. Okay? So, Israel smote them, took his land, and dwelt in his cities. Okay? Sometimes there are battles that we have to fight. Okay? Do we want to fight them? No, not necessarily. Right? Did Israel want to go to war with Sihon? Was that their intent? No, it wasn't. But that's what happened. Okay? Sometimes there are battles that we have to fight as Christians, even though we didn't start it, we didn't want it, we didn't instigate it, but now we're in it and we have to deal with it. Okay? If you look back to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 and 16. Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 and 16 says, And Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, right? So this is the part of the land in relation to, remember Noah, Ham, Canaan, those guys, right? When we talk about the land of Canaan, the promised land with Abraham, these are these people. They go all the way back to Genesis, right? These are the people that are being dealt with here. And the Amorites are of the descendants of Canaan, son of Ham. Okay? Also, if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 2. So keep a bookmark in Numbers 21. We'll be there. And then we're going to be in Deuteronomy 2 as well, because this is another telling of this same incident that Moses gives later on. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, it says, Rise ye up, take your journey, and pass over the river Arnon. Behold, I have given into thine hand Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land. Begin to possess it, and contend with him in battle. This day will I begin to put the dread of thee and the fear of thee upon the nations that are under the whole heaven, who shall hear report of thee, and shall tremble and be in anguish because of thee. Did Sihon have a legitimate reason to start this battle? No, right? There's no reason that he should have done that or needed to do that. But what is the reason that it happened? Okay? So why then did this battle happen? Peter.
Put the fear into the other people that were going to die.
Right? It's to put the fear of God into the other people, right? Because if we look at these verses, who's giving instructions in chapter 2, verses 24 and 25? Who's giving the instructions? God is, right? So much like we've talked about before, this is God's plan. Okay? God's saying, look, you need to get up, you need to go over there, this is going to happen, he's going to come down, you take care of that, and then you take his land. We win, right? But what's the point? What's the point in 25? Peter partly mentioned it. What? Right. Right? So who's included in the nations under heaven? Okay, anywhere there's land. Who's on the land? Think about it for a second. Who's on the land? We know that they're going to go into the land of Canaan, right? And you got all the ites and people there, right? Okay, so they're going to put the fear of God into them, but who else? Who else is there? The Israelites are there, right? Right, so it's both into the Israelites and into the other nations. And we'll see how that works later on, right? Because remember, when Israel first came to the Promised Land 40 years ago, what was their attitude? What was their mentality? How did they feel? They were whiners. What else? They were afraid. They felt like they were going to die and rather be in Egypt, right? So what's part of what's working here is not only for putting the fear of God into other nations, but it's also to strengthen the Israelites themselves, right? If we take a look then in verses 24 and 25 of Numbers 21, right? Israel smote him. Israel smote him and took his land and dwelt in his cities. In verse 31, again, it says, and Israel dwelt in the land. Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites, right? Numbers chapter 21, verse 31. But if we flip back to Deuteronomy 2, where we just were, in verses 32 through 36, then Sihon came out against us, he and all his people, to fight at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him before us. And we smote him and his sons and all his people. We took all his cities at that time and utterly destroyed the men and the women and the little ones. Of every city we left none to remain. Only the cattle we took for a prey unto ourselves, and the spoil of the cities which we took. From Aroer, which is by the brink of the river Arnon, and from the city that is by the river, even unto Gilead, there was not one city too strong for us. The Lord our God delivered all unto us. Right? So as we've seen before, not only is this God's plan, who's doing the work? God is, right? So now, as we've seen all the way through Genesis, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, right? Creation, go all the way back. Whose plan is this? God's plan. Who's doing the work? Randy.
God's people because of God.
Right? God's people because of God. Right? Okay? It says there, look, none of these cities were too strong for us. This isn't even the promised land yet. This is the going towards it. Now, if we remember 40 years ago, what was their attitude? They were fearful. Why? They were going to die. They're giants. What else? The cities were too strong, right? The people are too strong. We can't. Fear, right? And it was too strong. But this time, none of the cities were too strong. Okay? So we see an attitude shift. We see even a declaration, the Lord our God. He's the one that did this. He's the one that provided this, right? Okay? So, as a quick side note, we want to take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 2. So again, we're going to be flipping between Deuteronomy 2 and Numbers 21, 22, back and forth, because that's the retelling of the stories. So in Deuteronomy 2, verse 19, Deuteronomy 2, verse 19, and when thou comest nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them. For I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for a possession. Okay, so we just read the Amorites, right? Israel just took over their land, their cities, and they went up into the border of Ammon. But the border of Ammon was strong, right? Now, could Israel have taken over the children of Ammon if God had wanted them to? Yes, right? But what did God tell them? No. Those are not for you. You leave them alone, right? Okay? Do not distress. That's an interesting word. Hopefully we'll get to that in a little bit, right? Do not distress them. Do not meddle with them. Leave them alone. They're the children of Lot. Okay? So we'll remember that. Back to Numbers 21. Numbers 21. Our second story here. Numbers 21, verses 33 through 35. Numbers 21, 33 through 35. And they turned and went up by the way of Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to the battle at Edrei. Right? Okay, so they're progressing. They're moving up. They're going up towards Bashan. And Og and his people come out together. Og is also an Amorite. Okay? Verse 34 then tells us, and the Lord said unto Moses, fear him not. For I have delivered him into thy hand, and all his people and his land, and thou shalt do to him as thou didst unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, which dwelt at Heshbon. Okay, so why did the Lord have to tell Moses, fear him not? Who knows? He was huge. Define huge. He was taller than Goliath. This dude is a big cat. All right? Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy 3, verse 11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. All right? So here we have our nice giant buddy, Og. Okay? His bed is roughly 13 and a half, 14 feet by 6 feet. Stay. All right? That's bigger than some rooms that we have in our houses, right? 13 by 6. That's a big cat right there. Okay? Now, what's funny, though, is who determines the size of a cubit? Oftentimes, it's the king that determines the size of a cubit. So if you got a huge king, what else do you have? You have a huge cubit, right? So this guy roughly is anywhere between 11 and maybe 15 feet, right? Okay. So now think about this, right? When we talk about Jericho in a couple weeks, and Israel's marching around Jericho, spoiler alert, right? And the height of the walls are like 25, 30 feet high. And they're like, dude, what are we going to do with that? Right? But think about it. Who are they defending against? Right? They're not defending against, 5, 6 foot Israelite. They're defending against 13-foot Og. Right? If you have a 10-foot wall, he's looking over. Think about that. Right? If you have a 15-foot wall, he's pulling that down. So think about the defenses that these other cities have to have. That's who they're defending against. Okay? So now as we look toward in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 3 through 5, so the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og also, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him until none was left to him remaining. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we took not from them. 70 cities. 60. All the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. All these cities were fenced with high walls, gates, and bars, besides the unwalled towns, a great many. Right? So they took 60 high walls. Right? Because look, not only are you defending against Og, but if you're Og and you're in one of those cities, you want to be protected. So you need a wall higher than you. That way you don't get hit. Right? See how defense works? All right, very good. Okay. But there were 60 cities, all high walled. Was there any that were too strong at that point for Israel and with God? No. Okay. So, as we start to see, we can foreshadow because we know what's happening later on, right? But as you see, when Israel first went into the promised land or was going into the promised land 40 years ago, they were like, man, these cities are nuts. These people are nuts. We can't go in there. What is God doing? Taking away their fear, right? Putting their trust in Him. Because, right, these verses say, the Lord our God gave them to us. Not because we're amazing, right? But it's also bugging the fire out of these other nations that are around here. And we'll see that as we get into Jericho. Okay? Back to Numbers 21. Numbers 21, verse 34. And the Lord said unto Moses, right, fear him not. Now, they could have had a legitimate reason to fear. That cat's big. That cat's been around for a while. It's funny. If you do any research on Og, there are crazy stories about him and like his longevity and just, you know, the tall tales like you get with Babe and the Blue Ox and those kinds of what? That's what they have on him. It's crazy how he would like go fishing in the ocean for whales and his, you know, the ocean is ankle deep compared to him. It's ridiculous stuff. But that tells you that's what they're thinking in their head, right? This dude is big. This dude has been around for a while. You don't mess with this guy, right? But yet God, in verse 34, says, I've delivered him. I have delivered him into thy hand, and all his people, and his land. Thou shalt do to him as thou didst unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, which dwelt at Heshbon. 35. So they smote him. It's a casual statement, right? So they smote him. And his sons and all his people, until there was none left alive, and they possessed his land. Okay? Very good. So, what's interesting then about these two battles with Sihon and the land that they took there and Og and the land that they took there is we're starting to see a transition. I don't know if you noticed it or not, but where's Moses in this? Okay. Remember the early battles when they first got out of Egypt, right? There was a lot of Moses involvement, right? He's holding the rod. When the hands are up, they're winning. When the hands are down, they're losing, right? When they're parting the Red Sea, all this stuff. There's a lot of Moses involvement in their lives. Where's Moses in this? Okay. Randy? Right? Look, the security you have, the assurance you have, it's not in Moses. Right? It's not in your lineage. It's in God. Right? And that transition here is being made. Right? Because the fear of God over the other nations, the fear of God in Israel, not the fear of Moses. Not even the fear of Joshua. Right? It's the fear of God there. Amos chapter 2. Amos chapter 2. It's on page 909. Amos chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Yet I destroyed, this is God speaking, yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above, and his roots from beneath. And also I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and led you 40 years through the wilderness to possess the land of the Amorite. Okay? So again, God speaking here, what did God do? Randy, what did God do? Okay, got the reassurance. God took these people out. God says, look, I took you out of Egypt. Right? Because remember, we had just talked about last 2 weeks how Israel rebelled and murmured against Moses because, well, you brought us up out of Egypt. No, Moses did not bring them up out of Egypt. God brought them out of Egypt. Right? God took care of Og. Does God say that Og is big? Yeah, God recognizes that. He says, yeah, he's a big dude. Guess what? That don't mean nothing to me, right? The degree of difficulty does not mean anything to God, right? We've talked about that before. What else? Psalm 135. Psalm 135, verses 8 through 13. Psalm 135, verses 8 through 13. Who smote the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and beast? Who sent tokens and wonders into the midst of thee, O Egypt, upon Pharaoh and upon all his servants? Who smote great nations and slew mighty kings? Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, all the kingdoms of Canaan, and gave their land for a heritage unto Israel, his people. Thy name, O Lord, endureth forever, and thy memorial, O Lord, throughout all generations. Right? So if you remember, the Psalms are written later. Right? Some are written by Moses, etc. But as you go through the history of Israel, it's funny how they go back to Egypt. The history, God brought them out of Egypt. They often mention Sihon and Og and what God did there. It's like, look, people, you need to remember what God did for us. Look where we came from. Look who did this. Right? Trying to tell them, again, that the degree of difficulty doesn't matter to God. The size of your problem doesn't matter to God. Because whose plan is it? Who's doing the work? Right? We're going along for the ride. Okay? Psalm 136, starting in verse 1. Oh, give thanks unto the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks unto the God of gods, for his mercy endureth forever. Oh, give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his mercy endureth forever. To him who alone doeth great wonders, for his mercy endureth forever. If we jump down to verse 16, to him which led his people through the wilderness, for his mercy endureth forever. To him which smote great kings, for his mercy endureth forever. And slew famous kings, for his mercy endureth forever. Sihon, king of the Amorites, for his mercy endureth forever. And Og, king of Bashan, for his mercy endureth forever. And gave their land for a heritage, for his mercy endureth forever. Even an heritage unto Israel, his servant, for his mercy endureth forever. Right? That last verse made up an interesting point. What is Israel? Servant, right? What is the servant supposed to do? Huh? Do what he's told, right? He's supposed to obey. "40 years ago, what was Israel told to do? Go inherit the land. Go. This is where I told you to be. Go. Do it. And what did they do? No. I don't want to. All right. Guess what? We don't have those servants anymore. We have the next generation of servants. Now, are they going to do what they're told? Right? Fighting against Sihon, fighting against Og, building up that fear, that trust in God. Right? Okay, what about us? What have we been told to do? Randy?
I notice it's like a precursor to Job where you don't fear, except I am God, I feel the question. But when it comes to Job, it gets a little chastised.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right when he's talking, God is talking with Job in the struggles that Job is going through. Well, again, who's working that? God is, right? And what's God's response to Job? Where were you? What'd you do? What kind of skills you got, Job? Can you? And Job's like, my bad, I'm sorry. Right? Okay. All right. So again, we have this precursor, the faith in what God said he would do going into the promised land. Right? If we jump ahead to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. This is when the spies are with Rahab, right? And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, when ye came out of Egypt, and what ye did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. We have heard. What's interesting about that? Have you thought about that? That statement that she made? We have heard. What's interesting about that, Chuck?
Well, I don't know if I'm giving the answer you're looking for.
Probably not, Chuck, but go ahead.
The next verse, at the end, she said, he is God.
Right.
So, God's not just doing this for Israel. The whole world needs to know who he is.
Right.
And they feared him.
Okay.
They didn't fear Israel, they feared the God that was bringing them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's where my mind went right now, what was going on. Because these are people just like the Israelites. They just don't have God with them. They're worshiping idols.
Right. Okay. So what did they hear? Peter. Sorry.
Well, they heard the great stories of what God had done. Obviously, this was so amazing that word spreading, sounds like everywhere.
Word is spreading. How is word spreading?
We're talking about it.
Who? Who is?
I would guess probably a scout cell something reported it, rumors spread through people, so maybe survivors.
Because Israel hasn't been here.
Right, yeah.
Chuck.
Well, I mean, they trade with Egypt. So, and the Egyptians were totally annihilated.
Sure. Hi, Shirley.
So, but then even with, Og and Sihon,
Yeah.
there were other people that had some interaction or were aware of their presence, even if it was just to avoid them.
Right.
Well, they're not there anymore.
Right.
And who did that?
Yeah. How long ago was the crossing of the Red Sea?
40 years?
40 years ago. They still remember that. They're afraid of that. They're going to see it with the Jordan too, and they're going to be like, oh, nuts. Not again. Exactly, right? Now we're in trouble.
We have heard, what did they hear? The God of Israel is greater than their God. That's what they
Oh,
heard.
yeah. Yeah. That's good stuff, right? They've heard. They know. They're all afraid. Their hearts did melt, right? And then when the Jordan gets split for Israel, they're like, oh, man, we're done. Right? Chuck?
Well, what Rahab said in verse 11, her said, no, because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. The rest of the members of Jericho probably didn't believe that. They probably just
Yeah,
thought
maybe
your
not.
God is greater than, I think she had faith.
Yeah,
That's why she's in the lineage of Christ.
yeah,
A foreigner,
yeah.
not an Israelite, not from Jacob, right?
Right. A foreigner, not an Israelite, not saved, right? But she has more faith. But she has more faith and more fear of God than a lot of the Israelites did.
Right. And that comes from God. He's the one that gave her life.
Yeah,
Why he did that, I don't know. Why did he do it for any of us? He
Right.
loves us.
yeah. No, it's good. There's a lot of good stuff that goes forward. The Bible's an amazing book that way. We read through these stories sometimes and we just skim off the top of it. But there's a ton of good stuff there that if we just stop and rest on it a little bit, we start to, that was 40 years ago. They still remember that. Peter, do you remember anything from 40 years ago? Exactly. What's funny then too, though, is what she's remembering is what God did. Right? Do we remember what God has done for us? The way they remember what God did to these other people. Right? Randy?
Depends on what you mean by remembering. There's degrees of remembering. If it's embraced in your heart to such a degree, it's like branded there, that's a different type of remembering. It's kind of, I kind of call that.
This seems pretty branded there.
Yeah.
Peter?
I'm more serious. We remember the important things. It has to be pretty big to remember after 40 years.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff you forget, but there are some things you remember. Those are quite the milestone, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as we read through Psalm 136 there, right? What do we know about his mercy? It endureth forever, right? Why did the taking over of the land of the Amorites take so long? Right? Because if you remember, God had plenty of opportunity to take care of them before. Right? But he said, look, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Right? So, fortunately, God deals with us the same way. Right? We saw last week how, with the rebellion, the mercy of God, and how, look, tomorrow, God's going to take care of this, giving you the opportunity to get it right on your own before then. Right? The same thing is going on. It's like, look, Amorites, you have a chance. Right? Nineveh is a great story. Jonah, right, goes into Nineveh. Awesome message. God's going to wipe you out in 3 days. Right? Gets out of Dodge. Right? The mumble message. That's what I like to think of it as, right? Because he didn't want to be there. He's not going to proclaim it. Right? He's going to hide it. But then they turn. But then less than 100 years later, Nineveh gets wiped out during the prophet Nahum. Right? It's like Jonah would have rather switched, I think, with Nahum. They are, aren't they? Because that 100 years is like a generation. Right? So the parents get right, but the kids go south again. Or maybe the kids stay, but that next generation, it's off in the weeds again. Why? Why? Randy?
I repeat myself about memory. Like, if you got a tattoo of what of the concentration camp you are around, you'll remember that forever.
Right.
No matter how bad your memory gets.
Sure. Chuck?
I started listening and I lost my train of thought. God doesn't change. He would that none should perish.
That's right.
That includes, the people of Jericho.
Yeah.
Because at the end of Psalm 136 that you're reading, it says, referring to God, who giveth food to all flesh, for his mercy endureth forever. He gives food to all flesh, even our enemies.
Yeah. Rain on the just and the unjust, right?
And something you didn't read in Psalm 135, and you'll find it in Psalm 115, right after those things you read about all these things God did, he talks about people who didn't believe they believed which are dead, that don't speak. And those who do those things become like them. Rahab was probably the only person in Jericho that was quickened, because the others were dead.
That very well could be.
Their idols.
Yeah.
She said, no, that's God.
Right. That very well could be. That's an interesting point going into Rahab and in Jericho, because, right, if you go back to Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham's conversation with God there, it's like, well, are you going to destroy the city for 10 righteous? Right? And we talked about how last week, is it last week or is it this week? It was last week. How God has the ability to save his people. What is it? What was the wording there? Save his people out of judgment or out of persecution, but then the unjust to damnation, right? I forget the verse of how that went exactly, but the point is there, right? But if we flip back for a second, and how did Rahab know? How did Rahab know? She heard, right? We talked about how with Nineveh, right? How the generation after, or generation and a half after, they went back to wickedness. Why? Because they haven't heard, right? How did Rahab know? Somebody told her. So what does that tell us? What about our next generation? You got to tell them, right? You got to, right? What did God do for you? Your grandkids. What has God done for you? Right? We've talked about our testimonies, right? And how when we witness to people, we're not salesmen, right? What are we doing? We're giving our testimony. What has God done for you? What has God brought you through? Right? When people ask you, why are you so cheerful despite everything you're going through? Right? Who do you go back to? You tell them about God, right? Because his mercy endureth forever. Right? Because you're not going to die before your time. Right? It's God's plan. God's the only one that ends that. You're not going to, accidentally die before God planned it. Right? So that means you have something to do. Right? You have something to do. You have something to share. You have something to tell. Right? We've talked about before how, we have prayer lists every Wednesday night. Right? Well, we've heard all the needs. We've heard all the requests. And we remember some of the requests and we go back and ask later, well, how's Buck doing? How's Howard doing? Right? How's Shirley's sister? And all this stuff going on, right? But then God's mercy endures forever, right? Where's the answers? Where's the praises? Right? Because if we go back to prayer sheets from 10 years ago, those things have been answered. Why have we not heard? Because inadvertently, what we're teaching people then is that our God doesn't answer prayer. Because we don't say that our prayer was answered. Wow, that's a shot. Right? The things that we do accidentally, thinking, well, okay, I'll put it on that everybody can pray for me, but I'm not going to let everybody know what the answer was or the outcome was. Well, wow, why not? That's the part that they've heard. Right? That's the part Rahab heard. It's like, wow, we heard what God did. How he parted the Red Sea. That was 40 years ago. Has God done anything for you in the last 40 years? Right? Everything. How are you still here, Chuck? How are you still here? It's only by God, right? Right? We talk about the rain on the just and the unjust. what happens? You talk about Elijah when it didn't rain. Rain is a blessing in moderate amounts at a time, right? Are we as thankful to God as we should be? Right? The Psalms tell us 3 times in one chapter, "Oh, that men would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men." But why does it have to tell us 3 times to do that? Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? That's an interesting question. Why don't we do that? Are we embarrassed that we couldn't do it ourselves? Ben, can you make it rain? You cannot, right? So should we not praise God then for the rain we get? We just got rain yesterday, right? How many of you like the color green? Not as many as I figured, right? Because the grass is all green and lush and trees and things, right? Go down to Colorado or Arizona. It is not green,
We were
right?
just talking about that the other day. Usually by this time of year, it's brown
Yeah.
and crunchy.
Yeah, brown and crunchy. That is not fun, right? Okay? And that's a little thing. That's a little thing. We talk about how Chuck is still here. How are any of us still here? Without God, where would you be? If God took his hand off you, how close to Job would you be? Oh. Or would Satan not even care? Go ahead, Chuck.
Just thinking about, what Abraham was told about the fullness of the wickedness of the Gentiles.
Yeah.
When it would come in, just God's view on our economy, on those kind of things. And we're at that point where the fullness was in. He's executing this judgment.
Yeah.
Then I think about the Gibeonites, pretending they came from a faraway country. And it says they didn't ask God, right?
Yep.
But I suppose if they had asked God, God would have told them to destroy them completely. And, for us, when you think this way, you're judging God, which you shouldn't do. But you think, wouldn't you give him a chance, God? Well, they gave him 400 years,
Yeah.
And yeah, killing all the little ones, to me, if they haven't sinned or they haven't reached that age of discretion where you're taken out of the book of life, they're in heaven.
Right.
They're with God, But I don't know, it's the whole book, man. When you just think about who God is, you better just get on your knees.
I think that's part of the reason why we don't tell more about what God's done for us, because we struggle with it ourselves. How much God has done for us. And we don't, all the stuff that's in there, it's so good and it's so intertwined and it's so matches and there's a lot we as a Christian have to do to grow. And we're so, I think, too worried about ourselves trying to get our Pharisees right that, okay, I'll judge you and then just leave me alone and I'll work on myself, but I can't tell anybody else anything because I'm still screwed up, right? That was a little offshoot. But with that, we're going to have to end our epic adventure through God's Word today. You guys are dismissed.